I'm Ruth and I work on our livelihoods programme within the Food and Agriculture Pathway. We work quite closely with a number of you that I can see on the call. Thanks for joining. So today is the fourth hot topic and peer learning session that we've been doing to scale ambition and action on the human rights agenda. Human rights, as you know, is one of the 5 new member performance criteria within WBCSD. And we are very pleased to be inviting some fantastic experts into the room to help guide us in this conversation around applying a gender lens to human rights due diligence. And Louise will introduce our panelists shortly. I'm sure you're all familiar with Louise by now, but if this is your first session, Louise is an independent. Well, Louise, I shall let you introduce yourself when we come to that.
I've had the pleasure of working with Ruth for the last couple of years, and really thinking about how do we get members talking about human rights due diligence and feeling more confident with thinking about how to apply it. So obviously the first year was very much around how do we do training around human rights due diligence, and this second year has been about diving into the hot topics and really bringing it to life.
Thank you, Louise. Perfect. We don't have time, obviously, for a roundtable of intros right now, but we are planning on some breakout groups towards the end of the session. Really, really valuable and important to get your input into providing us with guidance on how we can most usefully work with you moving into 2023. So really looking forward to your ideas and suggestions then. Thank you, Louise. Yes, before we get started, a quick reminder of our antitrust statement that we show at the beginning of all our discussions. Please avoid any competitive sensitive topics. I can share this with you in more detail if you need to after the call. I am recording this conversation for our note-taking purposes only. And yes, please do mute yourself. If you can just pop onto the participants link and click more on the right-hand side and add your company name, that would really help for us to get a sense of who is in the room, and really important for our invited guests as well, who of course aren't as familiar with this constituency as Louise and I already are. And yes, please use the Q&A function. Like I said, we'll be moving to breakout groups towards the end of the session. And just before I hand over to Louise, a very quick reminder, I suppose, that on Monday, gosh, that's yesterday, the World Benchmarking Alliance released their updated results of the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark. I expect many of you have seen it. I'll pop the link in the chat shortly. And it showed some interesting results. They looked at about 127 companies across 3 sectors. The top 3 performers I noted were from the food and ag sector. And there were some helpful key findings, a call for more mandatory reporting, of course, recognition that board level or C-suite level oversight of human rights really helps drive improved performance. A call for more meaningful and ongoing stakeholder engagement, especially for those affected stakeholders, and noted not insufficient integration and engagement with supply chain and supply chain actors. So some helpful findings that can also help shape the way that we work with you moving into 23. That is much too much from me. I'm going to be quiet for a little while and do some learning myself. Louise, over to you.
So we are very, very lucky today to be joined by an expert panel who we're going to, a bit of a change from the way we've done it before. We're going to do a panel discussion. I'm going to kind of lead us through a bit of a conversation to get us going, but then there'll be a chance for you to ask questions. So please feel free to add questions to the chat. We'll try and pick them up as we're going along, or we'll pick them up towards the end. So joining me today, I have Pins Prown, who is the Human Rights Director at Natura and has a long background in human rights. She's got plenty to add thinking about a gender perspective. Dr. Stephanie Barrientos, who's an absolute world-renowned expert on thinking about gender and global supply chains. So we're going to be really listening and learning from her about some of the important research she's done looking at global agribusiness. Then Justin's going to be really supporting us with understanding what Mars has been doing in terms of thinking about how they apply human rights gender lens to their activities. And then we're also joined by Halima, who's another expert in her field who in gender and diversity, who comes from the Ethical Trading Initiative. So some fantastic panelists. So I'm going to get rid of sharing my screen and enable us to get into the conversation. So hopefully you're no longer seeing my screen and we're back to seeing everybody's lovely smiling faces. So Stephanie, why don't we get started with you? Can you give us a little bit of an idea about what do we mean by applying a gender lens to agribusiness, and what are the kind of issues we should be thinking about?
Yeah, thanks very much, Louise, and great to be with such a great panel and also great participants as well. So I think very importantly, gender is really, it's not just looking at biological differences between men and women, it's really looking at the social relations, social roles, which are socially ascribed. So just as a very simple explanation or example, anybody who says, well, women are better cooks than men, therefore women should all the cooking in the home, doesn't explain why the best paid chefs in the world are all men. That's just a very simple example. So in agribusiness, I think it really matters, and it matters for a number of reasons. Women play an absolutely critical role, particularly in some products more than others. But their roles are often hidden, so you often don't see them. So women are particularly relative to men. Men are more concentrated in the higher more senior positions, in the permanent posts. Women are more concentrated in the casual labour, seasonal labour, smallholder farming. Men are more are normally, because of legal norms and social norms, the landowners, but women often make a critical contribution as family labour, often unpaid and unrecognised. So there are definitely different, women play a critical role, but there are different relations. But the key thing, I think, from a human rights perspective, is firstly that a lot of the real risks are amongst these more casual, informal workers where women are concentrated. Those could be risks, I mean, at the worst end around trafficking, etc., but just general risks around gender discrimination. And also what we know is that when women get a good income and get supported, they're much less likely that their children will go into work, paid work, or into work. So therefore, it's really important to address the gender differentiation, and not to assume when you look at something that because you think of it from the perspective of men, that everything's okay. It's important to always think, what's the gender dimension to it? But I think also, very importantly, so you can really make a difference if you take a gender lens in terms of addressing human rights, both addressing the risks, but also promoting gender equality, improving and benefiting women, and therefore their contribution to production. And I think a lot of research has shown in many cases that when women have better pay, better conditions, are treated more fairly, then you're much more likely to get better quality, more efficiency, less labour turnover, and there's a very strong business case, therefore, as well as a human rights case. So there's a lot more I could say, but
thanks for kicking us off. Halima, can I come to you? I mean, why from an ETI perspective are you particularly looking at the gender lens?
Thank you, Louise, and pleasure to be here, everyone. My name is Halima. As mentioned earlier, I'm the gender and diversity expert at ETI. And for those of you who don't know, ETI is an alliance of companies, NGOs, and trade unions who try and work collectively to look for solutions to human rights risks in global supply chains. And we've been doing this for, I think we have 25 years next year, which is great. And for us, applying that gender lens is very, very important, because as Stephanie said, we know that, across global supply chains, women tend to be the more vulnerable workers who face a myriad of risks and discriminatory practices. And obviously, like she said, it also affects business performance. Not only is it bad for the workers themselves, but it affects the business. So for us and our members, really, it's about taking our members on a journey to try and understand where are these risks for vulnerable workers, mostly women, how do we mitigate against them, and how do we actually create change at a systemic level. A lot of businesses, a lot of companies have been doing this for many years. This is not new, but I think we need to almost rethink a little bit the way we approach it. So not looking at it as, we need to empower women, but actually taking a step back and going, what are some of the risks and underlying root causes for why women are more vulnerable in our supply chains? And then how do we mitigate against them and at the same time empower them so we have more equal supply chains? So it's at the heart of what we do. And like I said, we work with NGOs, we work with trade unions on this. So the worker voice is very, very critical to this. I think when we talk about human rights due diligence, it's easy to sort of get lost in the data, get lost in what's easily available for us. But very critical to that is the worker voice and really understanding from the worker perspective why, you know, these are risks for them and how we can improve conditions for them. So I think in a nutshell, that's it. I don't want to repeat what's already been said.
Brilliant. Thanks, Halima. And Pins, is this just about supply chains, or is this needing to apply to own operations?
Hello everyone, I'm Pins Brown. As Louise said, I'm the Director of Human Rights at Natura & Co. And for those of you that don't know, Natura & Co is the 4th largest beauty company in the world, comprises Natura Cosméticos in Brazil, Aesop headquartered in Melbourne, Australia, The Body Shop in the UK, and Avon International in the UK. And I'm sitting in the Body Shop Operations Centre on the south coast of the UK, and you can see I've got some very professional cardboard boxes behind me, but I thought that's a good place to start. So does it apply to our own operations? Absolutely. And that can include, you know, that means the people working in the distribution centre about 300 metres from me, whether they're our own employees or agency workers, because like most businesses of our size, we have both, or whether it is the cardboard in the cardboard boxes in the packaging behind me. And what are our policies and practices, including human rights due diligence, that relate to both environmental and social commitments that we have. And we are trying to get better as a business at looking at human rights through an environmental lens as well. So that has meant things like supporting the human right to a healthy environment, just transition, understanding only the very beginning. We certainly aren't advanced, but beginning to understand what do these things mean to us. So no, for us, it absolutely means our own operations. The analogy that I use until I'm blue in the face at work is that I cannot see any point in attempting to work with suppliers. And I think it was interesting how Ruth identified the fact that the CHRB report identifies insufficient supplier engagement. And I think working with suppliers on topics that you know you're not great at yourself, the analogy I use is if you happen to have children standing in front of your children smoking a cigarette, or maybe in today's world vaping, while telling your children not to do that, right? It doesn't lead to credibility or the starting point that you need. So that's the approach that we have tried to take in the business. Is we're transparent about what we do in our own operations, and we have to report obviously under legislation on modern slavery, and we try to give a picture of our whole program regarding our own operations and supply chains in our sustainability reporting, in our annual reporting, and in the regulatory reporting. But that's the sort of starting point of our lens, if you like, is where are we finding men and women differentiated across the supply chain. And I'd say again, only at the very beginning of trying to be more intersectional about that. So where have we got caste issues? Where have we got ethnicity issues? I'll give you a concrete example, because when I'm in webinars, I hate it when people don't give concrete examples. So we have to report in the UK on the gender pay gap, but ethnicity pay gap, which is coming, but not here quite yet. You know, we trying to encourage the business to get ahead of the curve in the case of those of us who are reporting in the UK, and trying to look at where we've got those paths crossing. So it's not just a gender lens, which includes men and women and anyone in between. It's also looking at other issues that affect people, whether that's their sexuality at work. Louise, you mentioned obviously the discussions in Qatar, whether it's race, whether it's disability, and looking at how men and women might be facing different vulnerabilities or strengths across those areas.
And it's topical, isn't it, Pins? It's kind of equal pay day around this weekend or today, depending on where you are in the world. What's that about?
It's just sad. So speaking as a woman anyway, it's sad, but for men as well, I'm sure. So today, I think it's the 15th of November in mainland Europe, I still can't quite say the UK isn't in Europe. And here in the UK, I think it was Friday, International Men's Day on Saturday. So it's the day where the gender pay gap means that for the rest of the year, women are working for free. Those women, you know, if you looked at the average gender pay gap, which I think is around 18 to 20% in many countries, it's higher and lower, obviously, in different places. So that means as of today, or last Friday, we should really have a movement where we down tools and start demonstrating like the Icelandics did in, I think, in 1973, was it 1978, to demonstrate what that means and get some attention. So it just shows how it's still such a problem, no matter where you are, whether you're at the bottom of international supply chains with all of the problems that that implies, or whether you're like me, lucky enough, a well-educated, not underpaid woman, but still potentially paid 20% less than a male counterpart.
Thanks, Pins, for diving us in. Justin, lovely to have you here today. Kind of how are Mars taking the approach of thinking about gender?
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. For those of you I've not met, and I see a lot of names I recognize, I'm Justin. I work as a manager of human rights and gender equality at Mars. And hopefully I can provide concrete examples. Pins, if I say something that's too abstract, keep me accountable to making it real. So I'm happy to be as transparent as possible. So big picture, Mars thinks about gender across our full value chain, our workplaces, you know, getting your own house in order, but also thinking about our marketing and then up into our extended supply chain. And we sort of think about it as not just the right thing to do, but it's proper business sense. And that plays out across all three of those pillars. We know, I think the apparel industry was sort of leading in this when they realized that if all of your male models have six packs and throbbing biceps, you're only selling to 5 men in the world. And if all your female models are forced to keep their body mass index to some unreasonable level, you're selling to 5 women in the world. There are many different shapes and sizes. And so you want to sell to the full diversity of what the human body looks like. It's the same for selling confectionery, right? We want to make sure that everybody, men, women, everything in between and outside of that are targeted with our marketing, and who, when given a choice, are going to choose a Mars product. That we then look inside, and when we similarly are developing that business case where we know that gender balanced leadership teams have more diverse perspectives and come up with better solutions. And so we have a target around that. It's a tough, we're making progress at a much slower rate than I think we would like. We have an ambition to have 100% gender balanced global leadership teams, which means that there's 40 to 60% of any gender on every global leadership team. But it's a long road to get there. And part of that road is the issue of the talent pipeline. We have done a great job of hiring men and women at equal levels, but a terrible job of retaining women, especially at that middle management and management level. And that's issues around expectations and norms for parents that are differentiated between men and women. So we have a global parental leave policy that covers, an equal parental leave policy in the US, at least, that covers both men and women. But we know that despite that policy, that cultures and norms push men to return to work much faster, and women encourage women to maintain to take advantage of the full benefit. And that creates all sorts of distinctions, differentiations across earning potential and opportunities for promotion. So that's in our own workplaces. And then if we look out into the extended supply chain, we know that when women have equal opportunities to access finance, loans, inputs, all of the great things, that communities are more resilient to shocks. And we see that play out through COVID-19, where women who had been reached through those extension services suffered lower rates of food insecurity, income volatility, and are therefore less likely or more likely to keep their children in school instead of working to earn additional income. So that's just sort of how we think about it at a big picture. I think half of the battle for us is selling that story to our own leadership. I think us practitioners, everybody on this line, we know the issues. We see some of the solutions. We collaborate with one another. But how do you get someone whose role it is to think about profits and losses to take on our perspective? How do you get your procurement colleagues to bake gender transformative sourcing into their everyday practice? That's the battle. And so part of what we've done to shift that momentum, to make sure that it's not just a room of practitioners who all agree with one another, having the same conversation we've been having for 150 years. It's really about taking those peripheral actors, those who sit in P&L roles, those who sit in corporate affairs, to join the conversation and become change agents. And part of that was our Here to Be Heard report. We asked one question to the world: what needs to change for more women to reach their full potential? And ended up receiving 10,000 responses from 88 countries of women from a full range of diversity of what life means. You know, we had old, young, Black, white, gay, straight, trans, everything. And we can disaggregate that data based on demographic information and find out what different groups of women are saying in their response to what needs to change. And that came up, we sent it over to Oxford Saïd Business School because they can do things we can't. And we came up with 8 themes. And those 8 themes are now informing what we're doing in our own workplaces, what we're doing in the extended supply chain, and what we're doing in marketing. And the last thing that I'll say before I pass the mic back to you all is the way there were 10,000 responses from 88 countries. They were verbal responses. You submitted your voice on a website through a voice recording. Tons and tons of data. Some answers were as long as 10 minutes. Some were 1 word. And so the AI was designed to filter through the hours and hours of recordings and bucket other responses into themes. So it would say something like parent and leave and put that in a parental leave theme, or career and opportunity and put that in a theme. But there was 1 word that the AI didn't know where to put it. It stood alone. And it turns out it was the most common word if you filter out words like and, if, I. And that word was men, which is just such a profound finding. The question was, what needs to change so more women can reach their full potential? And the single most common word was men. And so that has become a cornerstone of our gender action strategy at all levels. We think about the role of allyship, sponsorship, and championship in the workplace. We think about approaching men as change agents in sourcing origins, and not just telling women that they have all of this agency and power within, but making sure men and the patriarchy don't stand as blockers of that power and agency. And then similarly, we're doing things about sports and marketing in the marketplace as well. So men have become sort of a central lever for our action plan.
So that's absolutely fascinating, Justin. Really, really interesting. And I suppose I now want to come back to Stephanie. You've done all this work on looking at supply chains and really thinking about what's needed to kind of change the dynamic. And I know one of the areas you've kind of focused on is thinking about the lack of data, which I'd like us to just delve into a little bit further. But we've talked about there that one of the key actors are men, but who are the other key actors that have a real role to drive the kind of transformative change that we need, Stephanie?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with so much of what has been said, and it's really kind of understanding it. I mean, just on the data piece, I mean, that's just been something I do think, particularly in agricultural supply chains, we need to differentiate between waged. I mean, don't forget, I work further down the supply chain, so it's great to hear Pins and Justin talking about sort of addressing gender issues within their own operations, but my focus has always been really at the bottom of the supply chain, almost, where you need to differentiate between wage workers and smallholders. And I think the smallholders get really overlooked in the gender dimension of that. So just if we want some concrete stories, I did a lot of work in cocoa in Ghana with a competitor of Mars, with Cadbury, over many years, and I was always told by my Ghanaian colleagues that always work with local researchers and local colleagues, oh no, cocoa is a male crop. It's a male crop. You don't need to look at the gender side. And I persevered, and they kind of placated me and said that was okay. And when we did a kind of time use study, we actually found that women play quite a critical role in early plant care and post-harvest, particularly in the fermentation and the drying, as well as elsewhere. But those were the 3 key roles. Later on, an agronomist from Cadbury said to me, we keep doing training on quality and yields, and they just don't listen. And I said, well, what's the critical things? He said, well, it's early plant care and it's post-harvest activities. And I said, well, who are you training? So he said, the farmers. And I said, but the farm owners, the farmers are men. People who do the work are women. And when they then shifted the training and took it to the communities and ensured that everyone involved could go, they got much, much better results. So it's just a very practical example. So I think there are for me, there are commercial drivers. And that was a very good example of it. Of course, the other big driver of change are the campaigns. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. Like it or not, Oxfam behind the brands, they focused on gender as one of the key issues. That really forced a number of companies to address gender issues. Kenyan Flowers in the 20s, Louise, in the 2020s, early on the 2000s, roughly. You were very involved when Marks and Spencer's, when there were NGO campaigns against particularly sexual harassment of temporary women workers, as it transpired often by permanent male supervisors who were able to make the decisions as to who got work and who didn't, and exploited their situation to get sexual favors. Those are just examples. And in both cases, we've seen, certainly in the Kenyan Flowers, big advances by addressing gender discrimination, by setting up gender committees, by giving women permanent contracts when effectively they are permanent workers, so they can't be exploited, but also really importantly, women being promoted then up to supervisor level and into management level. And as you get that kind of transformative change in the company, you often also get a culture change as well. It's not to say there aren't problems. University of Manchester, where I work, there are issues around gender discrimination, harassment, etc. There are in every workplace. But we've got the procedures to be able to make a complaint and address them. And I think that's so important right the way through the supply chain.
I'm going to come back a little bit more, Stephanie, to look at that a little bit further. But I'm going to come back to Justin, because I'm really quite interested in delving down a bit further into kind of cocoa and a little bit more about Mars's approach. How have you actually brought gender lens to life in cocoa supply chains, but also in other commodity supply chains? Is it just cocoa?
It is not just cocoa. And many of you will know Mars as a candy company, Snickers, Twix, all the good stuff. But now the majority of our revenue comes from our pet care division. So we employ half of the veterinarians in the United States and have a number of veterinary chains, and we feed, I think we reach like half the world's pets or something through our pet food. So we have a diverse supply chain that extends far beyond commodities that are raw materials that feed into snacking and confectionery. So for cocoa, similar to our Global Here to Be Heard campaign, we launched a listening campaign, which was all about understanding the risks and opportunities that women and girls face in sourcing origins, and did a participatory research study across 3 sourcing origins to do exactly that, speaking with women and girls, but also community leaders, traders, intermediaries, co-op leaders, to really understand what the norms and structures are that are preventing women and girls from participating in the cocoa supply chain and sharing the benefits with their male counterparts. And that sort of aligns nicely with what we did with Here to Be Heard, which is ground our action by beginning with listening. And I think that has sort of really helped us in seeing some of the nuance, and that's informing the action plan there. But we also think about gender and sourcing across our full portfolio. And just this year, we've refreshed our procurement guidance. I'm just in the process of wrapping that up this month, in time for the holidays, I hope, so that next year our procurement is gender transformative across our portfolio of raw materials, so that all sustainable sourcing efforts with our procurement teams of priority raw materials begin with gender at the core. And the theory of change for that sourcing is really grounded in a few key things. One is that women and girls can reach their full potential and have equal access to economic opportunity as well as social spaces. Then the other 2 are really about climate resilience and climate mitigation. So we've now baked climate into our gender transformative sourcing, which is a key intersection that I think the world needs to catch up on. And then the last is really about business risk mitigation. And that's where we come back to the business case. And that's a language that our folks who sit and look after P&L, that really resonates with them. So it's sort of a 3-pillared theory of change that we think is going to drive that action across the portfolio. And then the last piece that I would say, and this is a little bit more emerging, is some of the work that we're doing thinking about the carbon market. There are very few materials that big corporations like Mars buy where we are willing to have as little visibility as we have in the carbon market. We would never buy cocoa anymore the way that we're now buying carbon. We've talked about this big evolution towards transparency, towards knowing your farmer, know the supply chain, try to vertically integrate to the extent possible, reduce the risk. For carbon, we've gone back 50 years, and for some reason, we're all suddenly willing to buy this material based off of a project description that some intermediary has given you that's been verified by another intermediary. We need to change that. We need to take a step back and think about what due diligence is required to understand the risk to people, and in particular risk to women who are often more marginalized and left out of the co-benefits of the carbon market, to make sure that we're, first of all, do no harm, make sure that there's no negative consequence for local communities, Indigenous people, women, and other marginalized groups. And then the more interesting conversation is, how do we do good? How do we create a carbon market where buyers are flagging that there is demand for good quality carbon credit with meaningful co-benefits that accrue to women?
Fantastic, Justin. I've just popped into the chat just a couple of links, A, to the resilience journey work that Mars has done on cocoa, but also to a report that was released earlier this week, which is on work and opportunities for women from risk to rewards, which is really looking at, you know, what are the links between human rights and climate, and to help you evolve your approach to thinking more broadly about applying a gender lens. And that really brings me to PINS. I want to just explore this a little bit further. You know, one of the challenges I think for any business is kind of, how do you move beyond kind of a long list of risks to really understanding the root causes, to really thinking about how you move beyond kind of a compliance approach to, you know, let's just get rid of the worst risks, to really thinking about what the opportunity might lie. You know, how have you been evolving your approach, PINS?
When I was preparing for today, yesterday, I went back to, I've literally got it somewhere here on the desk in front of me. I went back 3 years. It's in the COVID time warp to when my job was still just in the body shop, and we had begun to change from a compliance focused approach to a due diligence approach. And given I don't know the level of the people in the webinar, but the basis of our program was an audit program with some positive projects around the edge, and we were shifting to a due diligence approach. And of course, what we did first was to try and do a risk assessment, which was externally commissioned. And there we got our hit list, our red map of misery, as an old colleague of mine once called it. So as you say, Louise, you know, the list of risks, which is the red map of misery, you know, how did we move forward, and where did we bring gender, both men and women, into that? And I think this is what I dug out, a hard copy on my desk at home, was an in-depth risk assessment. And this one is about the logistics sector. And so this speaks, I think, to both what Steph was saying about what's at the bottom of supply chains, and what Justin and I were talking about in some of the operations. So how do we do that? Is we were trying to identify our own, you know, where are our distribution centers in different parts of the world, and what were the issues in those areas, and what could we do about them, and to apply a gender lens in the fullest sense to both of those. And we were looking, for example, then at shipping, which I think then we were only just beginning to properly identify as such a big part of our spend. So I think that, and that mentality, it speaks to some of the comment in the chat about how do we change others of whom it isn't their day job. And my role at that time sat in the procurement department. My boss was the director of procurement, and my colleagues were the leader of direct and the leader of indirect procurement. So that was helpful, and that we were already sitting together. But that meant that in our in-depth risk assessment, we pulled out a gender lens, looking at discrimination and harassment, whoever it was against. So that could have been sexual harassment of female truck drivers. It could have been underpayment of indigenous drivers in Mexico, for example. Those are proper issues that are literally sat here in this document. And what did we do about it then? We sought to work with the colleagues of ours that manage our logistics tenders in procurement to talk them through a kind of slide deck version of this 25-page document, which went country by country, to look at where our risks were, to identify when was our next logistics contract coming up. And in the middle of all this, COVID happened and our roles got moved into a group-wide role. So suddenly we had the buying on behalf of the whole Natura & Co group, which, as you can imagine, was much bigger than just the Body Shop. And it meant working with procurement colleagues and responsible procurement colleagues to make sure that we changed our request for information, our RFI and our RFP processes. So those of you in procurement will know what I'm talking about when you're starting a new contract and you're seeking different tenders to come in. And so at that point, we began to tailor what went into the social and environmental criteria in our RFPs according to what came out of the risk assessment. And we were not expecting perfection, far from it. We were just wanting to get where were they at on this topic and to put that alongside the commercial criteria from the get-go. And that's what we did. And so that tender went through that process. And of course, we had to persuade some of our other procurement colleagues what was the purpose of this, and was it going to cause problems, or more importantly to them, was it going to cause delays? And put it into those terms. I could go on for a long time. I was thinking, listening to Steph about share, but I'll pause there and let others speak.
Great practical example, and I think this is the point, isn't it? Is sometimes starting a little bit closer to home with the procurement team with something they can really recognise, and then demonstrating the business benefits can then help kind of cement the interest in going a bit further and a bit deeper into supply chains. Halima, can I come to you now? And I'm just really curious to explore, from the Ethical Trading Initiative perspective, what do you see is holding business back from taking a more active role on gender equity?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, it seems to have a delay in my with my internet. So I think for us, and I would say that I think 99.9% of our member brands are committed to addressing gender inequalities. There's no doubt about that. I think it's just understanding how to go about this. And it's been alluded to by previous speakers. You know, companies, businesses have varying resources at their disposal. Some people, it's just a one-man team. Others have a huge team behind them. So it's about, how do you embark on this journey of really understanding these risks to vulnerable women workers in your supply chain and the root causes of these risks with the resources that you have available, and that will vary, and you know, depending on how vast your supply chain is. So really what we've been trying to do at ETI is to try and take members on this journey and take them really back to the beginning and focus on the data that you have available. I think it's been mentioned already, that data is critical. If you do not have that data to really give you a sense of the picture, you would end up investing in, you know, programs or projects with your suppliers, with your manufacturers that don't really bring about that systemic change. I'll give you an example in view of we need to be more concrete. So a lot of member brands focus on trying to address the gap of women in supervisory roles. I think it's something that, you know, we all agree, you tend to have a lot of women, you know, in the pack houses, on the shop floors, doing those sort of lower skilled jobs, and you don't see them in the supervisory roles. So it's a natural thing to say, okay, so how could we perhaps upskill women, give them those skills that they need to be able to apply for these roles, which is just one part of the puzzle. But speaking to one of our member brands a while ago about, you know, one of their supply chain programs where they were doing all this training for women workers to get them in supervisory roles, but they were just not progressing. And when they asked the women why was this, there were two reasons. First was overtime. So the women felt if they applied for these supervisory roles, they're not going to get the overtime that they would normally do. And they need that overtime to supplement the wages, because obviously we're talking about, you know, some countries we don't even pay minimum wages, talk less of living wages. So there's a wage issue there. If you're a supervisor, you don't get to do the overtime, so you miss out on those wages. And then the other thing was the unpaid care responsibilities. If you're a supervisor, you need to spend more time, and that eats into women's unpaid care responsibilities. They've got to go back home, do what they need to do within the house, etc. So for them, it just didn't make sense. But if you don't speak to the workers, and if you don't understand why you have this problem, you would end up investing hundreds and thousands of dollars or pounds or whatever it is, doing programs and not really getting the results. So really, it goes back to that data, and not just relying on audit data, but really going beyond the audit data, speaking to workers, trying to unpack, you know, why we see these gaps, why we see these risks, and then move on from there. So I think for us, that's been illuminating, and we are trying to work very hard on that. It's a long journey. It's a slow journey.
Such a good example, Halima. I can think of another example which I found really depressing when I was out visiting textile factories, and I was amazed that they were running numerous women empowerment projects, and they said, oh yes, that's because every customer wants us to run a women's empowerment project so they can note the number of women trained, and I said, but aren't you focusing on what it delivers? You know, why do women need to be trained 3 or 4 times on the same content? But at the end of the day, they said, well, we're not being asked that question, we're just being asked, can we put women through the training course? So it's really interesting how we as brands have a real role to reduce duplication and really focus on how does this drive the intended outcome and impact that we want to have. So yeah, really good examples. So let's just come back to Steph. You know, we've talked a little bit about this data deficiency. What have you seen as ways that businesses can overcome the data deficiency? Have you seen any good ways of doing it? Obviously, we've heard Justin describe you can use a bit of a survey as a way of capturing some views to help inform your strategy. What else have you seen? You're on mute, Steph.
Yeah, a very important question, and particularly in agri-food, and it does vary by sector, but I'll give you a very concrete example of where adapting existing technologies can help really to increase visibility of women, and that is in horticulture. So because of traceability, you've got food standards going right the way through to the handling of product, which means that data is being collected on everybody who's involved, but that data is often not gender disaggregated. So you know how many people, but you don't know whether they're men or the women, and then therefore specifically which roles men and women play. But a lot of food companies and agribusiness companies are now introducing agri-tech and digitization of different forms. And we did a small project with one vegetable exporter from Kenya, where they were introducing digitization right the way through to smallholder level. And we worked with them when I was on the WOW program to ensure that digitization collected gender disaggregated data so that they could get a much better picture. It was a very minor changes. It would literally take, they'd get hold of the tech company, they'd say, can you just twiddle that? Can you twiddle that? Can you twiddle that? Come back and say, right, that's it, we've gained the data now. So it was just thinking about it and integrating it into the processes. Now, of course, the next thing is what do you do with the data, but at least you're collecting. If you're not collecting it, women just remain hidden. So the next step, and this is a company that was highly committed to business and human rights, but they've now got the basis on which they could monitor change over time. But I would also very much second Halima's point that in trying to make change that really benefits women, you really need to engage with them and talk to them and find out what changes. So very simple things. When you do the training, do you do them in school hours? Do you do them close to in close communities women can easily attend? And then also, does that lead to more women moving up the supply chain into better positions and themselves then being able to influence change in the future? So that's where we want to go. That's the kind of the pipeline we want to get there, but we do need to track change over time, and it can easily be done. Not sometimes more difficult, but certainly do it where possible.
I'm curious because often when we end up in this conversation, we talk about targets and we talk about whether or not targets drive the right kind of behaviours. I'm going to come to Justin and Pins here. You know, I'm curious, does putting a numerical target get the business to more engaged? But what's been your experience about what's the right numerical target to set? I don't know who wants to go first. Justin.
I can jump in. It's such an important question, and I'm so happy to have all of these brands on the line to have it. So I think a couple of things. One is, yes, targets do drive behavior, and behavior can drive better outcomes for people. It's just what that target is, how it's shaped, and how it's framed. So I think there's been this race that no one asked for, but it has emerged to have the biggest reach number in the world for how many women you've reached through a program. And I don't think that we genuinely want to participate in that race any longer, because I would rather see meaningful improvements in people's lives over giving tens of millions of women a tampon, $1, and a one-time training, right? That doesn't meaningfully improve her life or increase the likelihood of her daughter growing up to finish school and be whatever she wants to become. And so we're focusing on how do we deepen our engagement with a smaller cohort of women and use reach as its intended use, which is a leading indicator, not an outcome indicator. And part of the issue is that as brands, we're challenged, especially in the extended supply chain. We want to have a program focused on women in cocoa, and another one in mint, and another one in palm, and another one in carbon. How do you measure the aggregate outcomes across programs where the risks are different, where the challenges are different, the barriers are different, and the opportunities are different? And that's why many of our peers, and ourselves included, have boiled down to reach. It seems to be the only way you can compare apples to oranges and talk about the investments that you've made. And that's one of the things that we did this year. We took about the entirety of 2022 to consult with experts, have workshops, and we are now moving away from reach as an outcome indicator towards a new indicator, which hasn't quite been signed off on, but will measure outcomes in an aggregate way across programs we can now provide to our procurement teams and say, reach is no longer your outcome. You have this new outcome you're driving for, and reach is going to be used as it was always intended to be used, just as the input indicator, the leading indicator, and you're expected now to achieve outcomes. And part of achieving outcomes is investing in MEL. Unfortunately, there's no way to measure outcomes without a rigorous baseline, a rigorous midline, and a rigorous end line. And we have to be willing to make that investment in order to make any sort of claims about outcomes over time.
Brilliant, brilliant. Pins, what's your view? Do we need a numerical target to drive real change?
I think it's a more mixed answer. Because you said, does it drive change in the business? And I think I'm speaking on behalf of 4 businesses, and they have different cultures. And I think it comes, so are targets important to focus some minds? Yes. Should they be the be all and end all? No. And I think this to me relates to the overarching question of today's training, which is, how do you bring a gender lens? And I think the answer to that is you think differently. So thinking along, this is our target and we have to reach it, and we need to have, as Justin just described, as rigorous as we can an approach to that with gender disaggregated data, and we can't do things without the data. Yes, all of that is true. But I also think there's the culture eats strategy conversation adapted, which is culture eats targets, because businesses or organizations will find ways of showing that they did or didn't meet the target, just as you've described, Louise, with the number of people who've been trained versus the impact. So I think targets are relevant because they do drive change, but we need to go well beyond them. And we can do that individually, where, okay, if the business sets you a target, then fine, you might be trying to meet that target in whatever way. But what is the organization not doing that it ought to be doing? And again, Justin in particular touched on the social norms around us. So where can we challenge all the time and change the culture of the organization that we're in by lobbying for small steps? And that's within all of our power, right? Any person in any organization can make those changes with whatever power they have to hand, whether that is policy, whether it's how you talk to a colleague, how you include people, So I don't think we need targets to bring about change. I think we have to change our minds about how we operate. And I literally used to sit with my old team, and we'd have our kind of corporate OKRs, those are our objectives and key results, and we'd have what are the objectives that our team is supposed to be driving towards. And then I would say with my colleague Heather Ducharme, so what are our actual objectives? What do we want to achieve? What do we think ought to happen? Because we're going to remember that for our annual planning as well. And that may be what no one else in the business thinks we ought to do. But if we think it's what we ought to do, and we're responsible for change in certain areas, then we're going to bring that to our work. And that, the listening to men, again, as Justin described, like constantly saying to people, this is about men as well, or this is about other areas of discrimination as well, as I tried to do at the beginning of this conversation. So I think it's got to be broader. It's both and, not targets or no targets.
It's interesting. I was running a diversity and inclusion webinar last week, and I had a global retailer on there who had a fantastic program, amazing. But they said the moment they linked numerical targets to exec remuneration, they made more progress in 2 months than they'd made in the previous 2 years. So the interesting thing is, it's kind of where do targets fit in? And you know, what I think what you're all describing is the fact that you need them, but you need the right targets, and you need the cultural change as well. It's not one or the other. Now, I'm sure Steph wants to come in on that, but what I am very curious of is, you've had a long time listening. I'd love some questions, because I really think it'd be great to hear from you, or just some points of view. Do you disagree with the panel? So please, if anyone would like to raise their hands or add to the chat, I'd love to pick up some people for some questions. Stephanie, did you want to come back in on kind of targets, and do you think targets do the right things or not?
No, I think they matter, but they're necessary, but they're not everything. And certainly, I think I would really reinforce this issue of its mindset change. And one of the things in my own experience, particularly in the cocoa and in Kenyan horticulture and Kenyan flowers, is initially you often get resistance from men to change that they feel that might undermine their position in some way if women are given more equality. And I certainly, as a researcher, I'm very much working on the ground. I've seen so many different examples. I mean, just in cocoa, we did a small follow-up project with Cadbury, and by the way, both Cadbury and Mars were really leaders on the gender side from very early on. And we went, after Cocoa Life had been implementing a program with gender, which was very gender sensitive for a long time, we went back to 2 separate villages or communities, that were more than just the villages, and compared how the same program, led by the same people with all the same objectives, targets, etc., played out. And in one, the men really got the benefits to them as well as to women. If women were given more equality, were included, were participatory, they got better prices, they got better quality, they did well. And then another community in a different location, the resistance was, why are we doing this? Why are we being forced to do this? We're being forced to change. But they weren't as successful in terms of the sort of the commercial, in terms of the yields, and it wasn't the prices, it was the yields, so that they could sell more at the given price, because this was in Ghana and Cocoa Pod set the price. So I think, yeah, you're going to get resistance, but change takes place over time. I'm from the University of Manchester, and women didn't get the suffrage less than 100 years ago for all women without agitation and campaign for change. So I think it's really important that we all keep going and keep campaigning in the different ways we can.
Fabulous. I think that's what this is. You've heard the panel talk about it. It's about us as individuals as well as our organizations. You know, we've got the power to enact change. We've just got to use it. Now, I am curious for questions. I've got plenty more questions to ask this brilliant panel, but Ruth, have you got a question?
Well, I have, but I'm really reluctant to go first, because this is really for members. So Louise, can you see if other people want?
Nobody's got their hand up.
Okay.
Yet.
Okay, so firstly, thank you so much, panelists. What an amazing conversation. I'm so pleased that I'm recording this. And I think also, actually, Louise, it's great that we've not got slides. I always knew it was very hard to read and listen. And you can tell from the comments and the hurrahs in the chat that it's really, really resonating with the people in the room. So I'm very grateful to you. I do have a question. I found it very useful that the conversation started on the kind of what do we mean? You know, what do we mean by applying a gender lens, to the kind of why, so the business as well as the human rights imperative. And now, of course, we're digging into the how. And I'm guessing that a lot of people on the call will also be super interested in the how. We've talked about a lot of interventions. We've talked about, for example, you know, data acquisition, consultation with people, outcome orientated target setting, training and development, supply chain engagement and procurement practices, cultural change. my question is, are there any good existing tools out there that walk companies through this how, that kind of unpack the necessary, not in an overly prescriptive, but unpack the necessary steps that one needs to take to advance gender equity? Are there existing tools?
Great question, Ruth. And I can see actually, Zoe, I missed your question. Do you want to just say what your question is, and then we'll go to the panelists to see what their answers are to both?
Yeah, of course. I also was a bit reluctant to jump in first, but delighted to. So first and foremost, thank you to the speakers for such a wonderful panel. I will say I have the privilege of working alongside Pins, but I'd love to ask the speakers what mindset shifts in particular they think could make the greatest difference, because I know mindset shifts has been a theme of this discussion. So any specificity on what those mindset shifts look like in practice would be super helpful.
Perfect. Well, Halima's got a hand up first. Fabulous to come to the answer. So tools and mindset shifts.
I can dip a bit in the sort of mindset shifts, and I think you've already mentioned it already, but procurement teams, commercial teams, that's where the gold is. That's where we need that change, because I think everybody here on the call, we're preaching to the converted. We know we need to do this. We know we're probably making slower progress than we would like to, and the people who we need to bring on board with us on this journey are the buying teams, the procurement teams, the commercial teams. Those people who perhaps, are not necessarily driven by, these types of business case arguments that we put forward. It's more about the numbers. And let's be honest, we're in a very difficult economic climate at the moment. Businesses are having to make tough decisions about, cost pricing and putting in orders and etc. So we need to, I guess, be mindful of the sort of climate we're in. But if we can preach to the to the commercial teams and get them on board, I think we would definitely see quite a lot of change. And for those of you who are interested, ETI has been doing quite a bit of work on this. Happy to share the links for some of the work that we're doing around sort of getting commercial buying teams to really get on board.
That would be brilliant, Halima. Anything you can share, that would be great. Justin, I think you were next.
Thank you. And I think this builds nicely on what Halima said, and could not agree more on the critical role of procurement. What I was going to offer for your question, Zoe, is the mindset shift around moving away from gender equality being a narrative of scarcity and being one of abundance. And that narrative is critically important for getting men involved in this conversation. There is this false narrative that is bought into by most people that says for women to become equal in the workplace, to become equal in governance, to become equal in all strata of life, men need to sacrifice. And that narrative is just utterly false at all levels. When women have equal opportunity to participate in our economy and in our governments and in civil society, the pie grows. There is an abundance of opportunity, and everybody, men included, have the opportunities to rise. And we therefore see more resilient sourcing communities, we see more competitive business, and we see governments that take more progressive action on critical issues like climate change. So the extent to which we can make that narrative clear, especially internally, this is something we're doing at Mars, the narrative of abundance, not of scarcity. Then we get to the question of most men, and there's research about this, very few men in the world wake up and say, oh, I cannot wait to be really, really sexist today, right? No one says that. But here we are hundreds of years away from gender parity. And that's as a result of many unintended actions, beliefs, and norms. So once we get the theory of abundance over the finish line, what we then need to do is provide them the tools and the skills and the competencies to be effective champions, sponsors, and change agents. And that's the more challenging next step.
Fantastic. I love that theme of abundance. What a great way to frame it up. Pins.
I was going to just try to give my answer to Zoe's question as well. And Justin, you're a great speaker. I hope you do more of this. And I think it's refreshing. This is the thing. There was a time 20 years ago where if you had a meeting with gender in the title, you didn't have enough participants, and you certainly didn't have a broad range of participants. So it's good to see change across the room, not just in the panel, but in who's engaged in these conversations, even if it takes time. But in terms of mindset shift, I want to share two other concrete examples specifically related to the questions we had in the chat about financial colleagues and how to work with financial colleagues. And I'm going to give two examples, and it relates to mindset as well. One of them is, I believe that in many organizations, but particularly large corporations, in my experience, there is an invisible hierarchy about who is actually important. And anyone seen as sustainability is historically anyway not been at the top of that, right? I think that's changing, but that's not been where they've been in the hierarchy. And I'm just going to give you an example of a recent argument over budget that was had in our own organization about something which had been budgeted for, but owing to the publicly well-known, our results are public, they are not where they would want to be. We have a triple bottom line accounting, but certainly our commercial results are not where we would want them to be, owing to a range of factors. And therefore arguing over money, which will be familiar to many people on the call, is one of the things that happens. And for me, the mindset shift that people need to make on this is what we are asking for is just as important as what our commercial colleagues are asking for. And the line of argument that I use is that's my responsibility. I'm the Director of Human Rights. It's my job to advance human rights in the business. And it's that finance person's job to watch the money, but I'm just doing my job and they're just doing their job. And that narrative of yours doesn't trump mine. And there's a second part to this narrative, which is important, I think, and I think this is mindset too, which is, and I've been told this so many times, but I remember really clearly having this argument precisely with a finance colleague in 2018, talking about the Body Shop's fair trade supply chain of Shea, where we were talking about the price of Shea. And my colleague said, but Pins, we're not a charity. And I said, yeah, too right. And they're not a charity either. And if we pay below a sustainable cost of production and we make a markup on that product, we are exploiting them. And I get that those women are getting market access. They're predominantly living in a subsistence scenario. They want the cash, but they'd actually be better off growing chili peppers under their shea trees because they'd make more money if we don't pay them a sustainable cost of production and they don't pay their nut collectors a sustainable cost of collecting the nuts. So some sort of basic marks. So I think we need to educate our colleagues. I wouldn't recommend mentioning marks. I don't think that helps. But
I think your point there about being prepared to agitate for change,
right.
What we're seeing in this current tough trading climate is really important to step up and agitate for change, because right. if we don't, then we do somehow give reason to believe that this is a lesser important topic yes. than the commercial one.
Exactly. And that's what I mean about that. We're not a charity. Like, you don't understand commercial results or X, we're not a charity. I'm like, yeah, too right. And we aren't the ones sitting here, the people at the bottom of the supply chain absolutely need to sell their wares, but they need to sell their wares at a reasonable price or move on to sell something that they can get a reasonable price for. And cocoa, of course, that's very, very applicable.
Now, we do seem to have lost quite a few members of the call at the top of the hour, which is a bit of a shame. But I think that what might be good is not to break out, but instead actually to have a conversation, given the size of WBCSD, what should they be doing? What should they be doing to advance this important topic? What do you think, Steph? What should they be doing?
Well, I think one of the things, and this is this issue of change, and where I've really, because I've worked with many different companies over many years on different products, and I think you've kind of touched on it, Louise, but where you get senior company, the CEO and the senior management get it, then it trickles down, and that's where you do get shift. And I mean, there are some of those companies that are on this call, I won't name them, who I've seen make really quite significant change and really being progressive. But one of the things I think that can help, particularly in the private sector, is leading by example, taking the examples of companies that really have begun to address these issues. And this is a long-term process. This isn't something that's going to happen overnight. We've still got, exactly as Pin said, gender inequality in this country, so let alone anywhere else in the world. But lead by example. So we really need to promote the companies that do. I'm a researcher. I'm not in the private sector. If I go along to a company and say, I think you should do X, Y, and Z, they're not going to listen to me for 1 minute, quite rightly too. But if I go along and say, but a leading company in your own sector is doing it and doing commercially very well, that kind of shifts the whole dialogue. So I think in this kind of forum, you've got some really key companies in the agribusiness sector right the way across the value chain. But the other thing I think also is that addressing gender and having a gender lens on human rights it's not just the individual company that can do it. You can't do it on your own. It's collaboration with other companies. And this is a very, very important forum to do it. Work together, learn from each other, share examples, share experiences, transfer from experiences from one sector or country to another. Context also matters. I mean, I should say that. I think it really depends on the country, particularly in the supply chain, the country you're sourcing from. And I think I've mentioned it to you before. I've been doing a lot of work in Africa in a number of commodities, but Kenya, for example, had a big change in their constitution in 2010, where gender really came to the fore. They've really been driving some of the UNGPs. South Africa, which has excellent legislation, hasn't been kind of pushing gender and business, business and human rights in the same way. So I think context also matters. And big companies can talk to governments, encourage them, because where you get a more favourable context, you can make more change more easily, I think.
Louise, can I just very quickly react to that? Because I'm just going to pop in the chat now a report. WBCSD is actually, to this point around no seniority, no priority, one of the initiatives underway at an organisational level at the moment is WBCSD hosting something called the Business Commission for Tackling Inequality. And it's a bunch of cross-sector C-suite folk that I know many on the call are involved with. Anyway, it's come up with an action agenda, with 6 action agendas, and one is creating economic opportunities and jobs for all. And gender is a big piece of that. So I'm hopeful that that will be an essential, provide some good groundwork and be an essential platform to lock in and secure that necessary senior level C-suite buy-in to champion some of these issues and really help us identify, concrete evidence base and action plans for how companies can really engage in this. Just wanted to highlight that very particular BCTIR.
It's trying to work out how you frame it up, but I suppose that from a human rights lens, we're always looking at who are the most vulnerable, and focusing on addressing those risks. But what I've loved about this conversation is also really focusing on why shouldn't everybody have the same opportunities. And really kind of also framing it through that light, being kind of challenging about why people don't have the same opportunities, real equity. Yeah, so I think it's good to see it through both lenses. And I've heard, for that, being able to think about it in terms of helping some of those senior leaders think about what their legacy is, but also think through the eyes of their children about what's the world that they want. And if they've obviously got daughters, that again could be quite a helpful way for people to think about it, not just through the lens of doing philanthropy and doing good, but really, what's the world I want my children to have when they come to the world of work, which can also be quite helpful. Love some other inputs. Pins, what do you think WBCSD should be doing?
The honest answer is I don't know enough about it.
Okay, well, that's fair enough.
My colleague Kayvan keeps me up to date on broadly what is changing at WBCSD, but I think where would the sort of USP be on this topic for WBCSD? Too many acronyms. I don't know. Sorry.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting, isn't it? I think, Stephanie, one of the things you said was learning from each other. And certainly some of the examples that you have shared, Justin and Pins today, and I know that others we've collated as part of our own human rights effort at the moment on creating this evidence base. So not just the progress and that has been made, but the kind of residual challenges and top tips for other companies on how to better tackle them. And that could be something that I think would be of interest, certainly discussions like this. Louise, I don't think I got an answer, although I could be wrong because I've also been writing notes, to the question around existing tools.
I'm not sure you did either. We didn't hear. What tools would everyone recommend?
Because you see, maybe the answer is, well, there isn't any, and then we know what we need to do.
Justin, what tools?
I dodged the question because I couldn't think of a tool top of mind to answer your question. We create
Fair enough.
we create our own internal tools on due diligence, which aligns with the UNGPs. We create our own approach to long-term continuous improvement investments, both with our tier 1 suppliers, but also sourcing communities. And of course, we bring in subject matter experts along the way. I mean, we're very good at selling dog food and Snickers bars, but we're not a development agency, and that's where you have to crowd in others who can bring that expertise. But
But
So
also
I
just,
see- I was just going to say, I see Pins, you put gender due diligence document in. Halima, I can see you've come back on screen. I'm sure you've got some ETI tools you'd recommend.
Same one as Pins posted. I mean, I think it's difficult to have sort of one tool that does this. I think that's something that probably we should put out there. I think it's about that, and there are a lot of resources out there. We've got our own gender and human rights due diligence guidance at ETI, which we did a couple of years ago. It's about looking at what's out there and trying to pick bits from it. So for example, if you want to focus a little bit more on gender disaggregated data, there's guidance on that. If you want to look at, particular value chains or particular sectors, there's sort of more nuanced guidance. I think it really depends on what you're looking for. But the one that Pins posted was actually the one I was going to send as well, which is probably the latest, I think, tool out there that kind of takes you step by step on that sort of due diligence journey and help kind of go through it in a manner that we can
Brilliant.
make
Steph, did you want to come?
There isn't one.
Steph, did you want to come in on any tools?
Yeah, no, I think there are. And when we were communicating by email yesterday, Louise, you sent in one of your emails, you had some links to various tools, and there are. So I think if you could circulate those links, but I would agree very much with Halima. There are different tools tend to be better for different things. So a little bit depends on what it is you need and what you want. I mean, as a researcher, Dan Rees always used to say, if you ask a researcher what's needed next, they'll tell you it's more research. But as somebody who's focused on development for many decades and works very closely with collaborators in different countries, I never do it on my own. I think it's having that external advice, and particularly in relation to gender, I think where linking up with local NGOs. So you've got the tools, you can look and see what's available, but that's a little bit like a menu, it's like a shopping list. But you also need to go in and then think of the country and the context, and it does vary so much, between Africa and Asia, massive differences in terms of the sort of cultural norms, whether women are even prepared to talk to you about issues. I mean, in Asia, women often won't talk about sexual harassment because they're not only embarrassed, but it reflects badly on them, as if they were the fault, they were the reason. So it's even more than just embarrassment. So again, working with local NGOs, consulting particularly local NGOs, local researchers who really understand those norms and the culture and can guide you through as to what it is you need. And it's got to be practical, it's got to be workable, but you also need to monitor change. There's no point in investing in a big program or investing in an initiative and then just wishing and hoping in the wind that everything will work out. Just monitor change, even if it's at a fairly kind of low level from the beginning through to the outcome at the end. Obviously, ideally with sort of control groups, etc., but you can't always do that. So those would be my suggestions.
Thank you. I mean, I will put some more tools in because I think some businesses using the women empowerment principles can be quite helpful to have a board level conversation about, is the business serious about signing up to it? There is a toolkit that accompanies those, so that can be quite helpful at a board level, because sometimes that generates that conversation about, are we prepared to sign up to the principles, which enables you then to think about, well, and how do we actually go about putting these principles into action? So that can be quite useful. There is IDH have produced a gender toolkit, which is worthwhile having a look at too, quite practical. And I see Pins has also mentioned BSR. They've done some fantastic work on the kind of her health and her finance, which has definitely worked in supply chains I've worked in. So and there's a range of them. Gates have got a foundation gender equality toolbox, and so we'll put a few more of those in. But I think the point that's being made, which is you know, don't just take the tool and apply it. You really need to think about what the business case is and the reality for those workers on the ground to kind of tailor it. Lucinda, lovely to have Unilever come to join us.
Hello, hi there. Yeah, I was just following on from the tools question actually, and completely agree with what everyone said in terms of it's a suite of tools and a suite of interventions as well, and super important with that local context. But wanted to share that we've actually started using Diginex Lumen. I'm not sure if anyone else has heard of it, but a tool that has really been helping us in our gender sensitive due diligence actually. So primarily it's sort of two interventions, but one is around a supplier management sort of questionnaire and your more traditional sort of gap finding activity that way, based on 6 core drivers. But really interestingly, it's complemented by a worker voice tool with questions which sort of align to those to the management questions as well. So then the tool sort of does all the data triangulation to really help us sort of see that gaps. It's sort of a verification piece as well. We're using it very much from a sort of baseline understanding point of view. We'll then use it for our for sort of measuring progress as we go along as well. But yeah, a tool that we found really interesting because it's allowed us to reach rights holders and workers on the ground as well as management all in one system, so we don't have to do that sort of data matching up ourselves.
And have you learned anything different that you didn't know as a result of using the tool?
I think previously it was, I guess, more fragmented in terms of hearing workers' voices and hearing that. I think what we're and yes, we are as well, because we've struggled with access to, I guess, workers, because we're using this in our tier 1 beyond supply chain, so not in our own operations, but beyond, so obviously more difficult to access workers that aren't in our own operations. So for us it's given us that sort of more verified view and more holistic view in terms of what's happening on the ground, so that then we can sort of come in and work with suppliers. And actually we found suppliers being more receptive to when we've been coming in, because it's a sort of different approach. It's you were talking about it earlier, but it's not compliance, right? It's actually more that enhanced due diligence, sort of more proactive working together ways of working. And we are only piloting this quite small, and we're quite early in our journey, but I think we've been super impressed so far. So while we were talking about tools, I wanted to mention
thank you for sharing that. I'd heard of it being used for modern slavery, but really interesting to hear it being used with the gender lens. And I think you're so right that it changes the conversation with the supplier. Instead of it feeling like it's being done to them, you're instead bringing useful insight to help them drive their own people practices, which I think just creates a very different dialogue and conversation. One of you both working together to understand what it's telling you, which I think makes a real change.
Yeah, absolutely. And just another point on that, so the suppliers actually have their own view to see sort of the gaps and understand their performance as well. They also, so Unilever owns that license, but as if our suppliers using it, they can then send it down their value chain as well, or up their value chain as well, to sort of instigate gender sensitive due diligence in their own value chain as well. Again, we're quite in the early days, so we haven't started seeing the power of that, but the opportunity is there, and we've been using it in forced labour as well, and seeing success there beyond tier 1 too. So yeah, just to share with it, yeah, it's early days, but we're seeing promising results.
Thank you for sharing. Has anybody got any other questions? Because it is lovely to hear. We can see those names, but it'd be lovely if anybody else wanted to jump in, say something, although they completely disagree with the panel.
And we have shortlisted gender in food and ag as something to dive into more deeply in 2023. So if not now, we'll be coming back to our membership at the start of the year to get your input into our design and how to really effectively deliver that across the membership base. But this is something that is here to stay for sure.
Fantastic.
Last call.
If we don't have any more, oh, go on, Pins.
No, it wasn't a question. I was just going to say, did I gather correctly that you're going to collate all of the tool suggestions
We
in
are.
the feedback?
We are. Pins, you get a copy too.
Yes.
I would like a Twix with that though. Or a Snickers, depending on the week. That's also a tool to improve my, not improve my
concentration levels.
Yeah, you're not you when you're hungry.
Well, I think we're going to draw this to a close. Thank you so much to my amazing panel. Well, you know, they were fantastic. Really unpicking this topic, and hopefully for those of you that are on the call, we can see those who've messaged how much they've enjoyed the session. But yeah, you just really interesting once we get started, just to listen to you all. You've got different perspectives, but also very similar perspectives, and it's been a pleasure.
Yes, well said, Louise. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Great session.
Yeah,
Thanks for
thank you all.
joining.
Bye, folks. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Thanks for your time.
Eleanor. Bye.
Turn your recording off.
Thank you. How do I do that? There we go.